So everyone, welcome back to this new video. And in this video, we're going to be covering everything that you need to be knowing from the specification of Edexcel's politics, specifically the core political ideas. And in this video, we're going to be covering conservatism. So here's just a brief look at the specification, and we're going to be covering everything as mentioned here. So please feel free to pause the video if you need to take note of exactly what is on the specification. Let's go straight into it. So firstly then, conservatism's core ideas and principles, starting with pragmatism. Pragmatism is a key principle shaping conservative approaches to the state, society, economy, and human nature. It is the idea that decisions should be made in a flexible way on the basis of what works, rather than being driven by ideology or dogmatic thinking. The centrality of pragmatism to conservatism can be seen in the founding of conservatism itself. The emergence of conservatism was in large part in response to the upheaval of the French Revolution, which Burke saw as a dangerous departure from focusing on the teachings of tradition and what works in favour of ideology and utopian thinking. Conservatism instead advocates for viewing society and state action in a cautious manner that listens to evidence. This links strongly to their belief in tradition, which they see as the accumulated wisdom of the past that shouldn't be discarded in favour of idealistic visions of societal change. This leads to conservatism being very wary of major reforms and advocating for gradual change. In the essay on being conservative, Michael Oakeshott set out the conservative case for pragmatism. To be conservative, then, is to prefer the familiar to the unknown, to prefer the tried to the untried, fact to mystery, the actual to the possible, the limited to the unbound, the near to the distant, the sufficient to the superabundant, and the convenient to the perfect, present laughter to utopian bliss. He also set out the idea that the state shouldn't try to change the lives or wants of its citizens through utopian ideology, stating the office of government is not to impose other beliefs and activities upon its subjects, but to secure them in the enjoyment of what they have chosen. This opposition to radical idealist changes was also linked to the belief in human imperfection, that human beings are fallible and limited in their capacity to understand and engineer complex social changes. It is important to recognise that conservatives don't believe in no change at all. They are not reactionaries. In fact, the key principle of changing to conserve emphasises that whilst tradition should be listened to, some adaptation is necessary to maintain stability and prevent upheaval in the context of changing circumstances. Conservatives recognise that if they simply try to not change society at all, this then will lead the risk of revolution and complete societal upheaval. So then, pragmatism to traditional conservatism. In traditional conservatism, pragmatism can be seen in their deep-rooted preference for existing institutions and proven practices over theory or ideology. They are guided by the belief that the accumulated wisdom of history and tradition holds more practical value than the abstract ideas that socialism and other ideologies promote. Traditional conservatives view society as a complex and organic entity where each part has to play a specific role over time. Therefore, their approach to change is one of careful adjustment rather than overhaul, as they consider the disruption of long-standing systems and traditions as potentially harmful and destabilising. Pragmatism is therefore linked to maintaining social order and stability, with changes implemented only when necessary to preserve the fundamental structure of society. This cautious approach avoids the pitfalls of untested radical changes, favouring instead the security and predictability of caution. So then, pragmatism to one-nation conservatism. Pragmatism and the centrality of the need to change in order to conserve are central to the emergence and beliefs of one-nation conservatism. One-nation conservatives recognise that in the face of societal changes brought about by industrialisation and capitalism, some degree of state intervention and reform was necessary to prevent social unrest and maintain national cohesion. As a result, they advocated for pragmatic solutions that struck a balance between maintaining traditional values and instituting reforms aimed at improving the welfare of the less privileged. The Israeli government enacted social reforms such as the Public Health Act of 1785 and the Artisans and Labourers Dwellings Improvement Act of 1875, which improved the public health and sanitary conditions in towns and cities. These acts addressed the needs of the less privileged while maintaining the social hierarchy integral to conservative values. With support for socialism growing, this change was necessary to conserve the hierarchical stable nature of society and prevent a socialist revolution that would threaten it. Pragmatism also led One Nation Conservatives' emphasis on nationalism and nationhood, which was a strategic response to mitigate the risk of class division and potential social upheaval they posed. By promoting a cohesive nation and fostering a strong sense of national identity, One Nation Conservatives sought to unite classes and reduce support for socialist ideas and advocated for class-based unrest and revolution which threatened the fabric of society itself. So then finally, the new right's rejection of pragmatism. The new right's emergence marked a significant departure from the pragmatism that was central to early reforms of conservatism. They instead favoured a more ideological stance driven by a strong belief in negative freedom. This ideological drive was particularly evident in the critique of One Nation conservative thinkers like Michael Oakeshott. The New Right viewed their approaches, which embraced a degree of state intervention and social welfare, as a capitulation to socialist ideas and a dilution of conservative principles. Margaret Thatcher was openly critical of the post-war consensus that had been influenced by One Nation's conservatism's ideas, seeing this as a capitulation to socialist ideals and implementing a radical shift towards laissez-faire capitalism and directly taking on the working classes in the miners' strike. Neoconservatism staunchly supported laissez-faire capitalism, prioritising free market principles and individual autonomy over government regulation and social welfare programmes, which they saw as infringing on individual freedoms and market efficiency. In social policy, the New Right's return to traditional values under the banner of neoconservatism might superficially appear pragmatic, aiming to restore social stability and order. However, this too was rooted more in ideological conviction than pragmatic considerations. They saw traditional values as inherently correct and desirable rather than adopting them as a practical response to social issues. Thus, both in economics and social policy, the New Right's positions were largely driven by ideological beliefs rather than the pragmatism that had characterised some early conservative approaches. Next, then, another core idea of conservatism is tradition. Tradition is central to conservatism and is viewed as reflecting the accumulated wisdom of past societies and a profound connection between generations. To conservatives, tradition is not merely a set of customs. It's a reflection of collective experiences and lessons learned over time, offering invaluable guidance for how decisions should be made in society and by the state. This can be seen in conservatives' strong support for the monarchy and the Church of England. The enduring presence of the monarchy, steeped in centuries of history, embodies a continuity of leadership and national identity that conservatives deem essential. Similarly, the Church of England, established over many centuries, reflects not just religious beliefs, but also a historical and cultural continuity that is important to maintaining the structure of society. This respect for tradition is also seen as crucial for maintaining stability and scrutiny within society. It's through the lens of tradition that conservatives understand and approach change, favouring organic, gradual developments instead of abrupt, radical shifts. This concept of organic change respects the slow evolution of societal norms and institutions, ensuring that any change is rooted in the past and contributes to a sense of continuity. Edmund Burke saw tradition as a critical thread, linking past, present and future generations, creating a critical thread, Burke saw tradition as a critical thread, linking past, present and future generations and creating a sense of belonging and continuity. His great opposition to the French Revolution was in part due to his disregard for the teachings of tradition. So, very briefly, tradition to traditional conservatism. As the name suggests, tradition is a fundamental principle of traditional conservatism, influencing their beliefs on society, the state and human nature and the economy. Their views are entirely consistent with the explanation of tradition being a key principle of conservatism. Next then, tradition to One Nation conservatism. Tradition was also central to the ideas of One Nation conservatives, who completely agreed with the view that tradition should be listened to as the accumulated wisdom of the past. In the face of societal change under industrialisation, One Nation conservatives recognised the need to change in order to conserve the traditional structure of society and its key institutions. This greater use of state power to address societal inequalities was therefore consistent with tradition and in order to protect it rather than departure from it. And next then, tradition to the New Right. On the one hand, the New Right's ideological driven beliefs can be seen as opposed to tradition. Their views on society and how the state should act weren't driven by seeking to learn from the accumulated wisdom of the past. Neoconservatism especially was driven by seeking to promote individual freedom and a free market economy. However, on the other hand, neoconservative support for anti-permissiveness advocated a return to traditional values. Neoconservatives viewed the increasing liberalisation of social attitudes in the 1970s, especially those related to personal and sexual freedoms, as a threat to the moral and social order. They believed that individualism was best pursued in a stable society rooted in the principles of Christian morality, and presented themselves as their defenders of conservative values in the face of these changes. Central to their concern was the preservation of the traditional family unit, which they regarded as a bedrock of society. They believed that permissive trends undermined this structure, weakening the societal fabric. This opposition to permissiveness also intertwined with their emphasis on national identity, where traditional values were seen as integral to preserving a unified set of cultural beliefs. So next, another key idea and concept is paternalism and hierarchy. Paternalism is a key principle shaping conservative thought on the state and society. It is the belief that the state should exert a benign influence from above, governing in the interests of the people. This concept reflects the conservative view that authority, when exercised responsibly, can be a force for good, guiding society towards stability and welfare. Conservatives see paternalism not about authority, but about responsible governance that considers the welfare of all citizens. Conservatives believe that paternalism enhances the social fabric and maintains stability in society by ensuring that those in positions of power use their authority for the greater good. The principle of paternalism is also rooted in their belief in human imperfection. Unlike liberals, they believe that not all individuals are equally capable of self-governance and therefore might benefit from guidance and support. Closely linked to paternalism is conservatives' strong support for hierarchy. Conservatives regard hierarchical structures as natural and necessary for maintaining order and stability in society. Conservatives view hierarchy as a natural and inevitable aspect of any well-ordered society. They are the people that are inherently different in terms of abilities, talents, and they believe that people are inherently different in terms of abilities, talents, and capacities, and these variations necessitate different roles and structures within society. This viewpoint holds that a hierarchical structure not only reflects these natural differences, but also ensures that those best suited to leadership and decision-making roles are placed in positions where they can be most effective. Different strands of conservatism has significantly different interpretations of paternalism and hierarchy, with the new right even rejecting paternalism outright. But starting with traditional conservatism's authoritarian approach to paternalism and hierarchy. Traditional conservatives' interpretation of paternalism is based on the view that the state, embodying tradition and pragmatism, knows what is best for the people, and all citizens should therefore follow what the state decides and tells them what to do. This approach is very authoritarian in nature, as it involves a top-down method of decision-making and governance by the ruling elite who are in power with no input from the general populace. Traditional conservatives believe that this model is necessary to ensure stability, order, and the overall well-being of society. In their view, the state's responsibility is to protect for its citizens, akin to a parent's duty to care for their children. Linked to an authoritative state was traditional conservatives' strong support for hierarchy, viewing it as an essential component of a well-ordered and functioning society. Traditional conservatives argued that hierarchy fostered stability and continuity in society. It provides clear roles and expectations for individuals, contributing to social harmony and preventing chaos, while promoting respect for authority and tradition. Next then, the One Nation conservatism and paternalistic state. One Nation conservatives are ardent supporters of paternalism. They believe it is the responsibility of the state and the upper classes to safeguard and look after the welfare of the less privileged people in society who are unable to look after themselves. They frame this within their broader message that society was one cohesive unit that was united by patriotism, building on Burke's view that there was an organic affinity between the upper and lower classes within society. This paternalistic approach is rooted in the sense of moral duty as articulated in the concept of noblesse oblige. The principle literally translates to nobility obliges. This embodies the belief that those in privileged positions have a duty to act with generosity and responsibility towards those less fortunate. This thread led to the governance approach where the state, like a benevolent guardian, takes proactive steps to improve welfare of the less privileged members of society through policies designed to alleviate poverty and provide social welfare. Importantly, One Nation's Conservatives' support for paternalism is not due to a belief in moral duty, but also a pragmatic strategy to uphold and maintain order, hierarchy, and the opposition of the aristocracy atop the social hierarchy in positions of wealth and power. They recognise that if those near the bottom of the societal ladder aren't looked after somewhat, this increases the likelihood of societal upheaval and potential revolution which could overturn the established hierarchy. Next then, let's look at the New Right's rejection of paternalism and hierarchy. The New Right fundamentally rejected the conservative principles of paternalism and hierarchy. They rejected the notion of the state as a protector and provider, instead arguing that excessive state intervention will not only curtail individual freedom, but also stifle economic growth and innovation. Instead of emphasising hierarchy and social stability, they were driven by promoting the principles of individualism, autonomy, and meritocracy in society and the economy, enabling individuals to work hard to determine their own position. They championed minimising government involvement in both economic affairs and social welfare, advocating for an economic system where market forces would dictate outcomes, believing this would lead to greater efficiency and prosperity. The New Right's opposition to paternalism can be seen in Ayn Rand's opposition to the concept of personal altruism, which she viewed as the moral obligation to place the needs of others above one's own interest. She argued that altruism, whether done by individuals or by the state, diminishes individual freedoms and success by creating an unhealthy dependence in those who are recipients of such altruistic actions. Despite their rejection of hierarchy, it can be argued that neoconservatism's strong support for laissez-faire capitalism and rejection of a welfare state or redistribution led to some level of acceptance of inequality and hierarchy. This being said, though, they believe such an economic system would create a meritocracy where success was based on hard work, even if it didn't do so in reality. Next then, let's look at conservatism's views, the conservative idea of capitalism and property. Capitalism and property rights are strongly supported by conservatives, rooted in the principles of pragmatism, respect for tradition, and the concept of an organic society. Conservatives advocate for capitalism primarily because they saw it as the most practical and efficient economic system. It aligns with their pragmatic approach as it was historically proven to generate wealth and improve living standards. Conservatives are also very wary of idealistic visions of changing the economy and society using state intervention. Oakeshott in particular saw the danger of this approach in the 20th century, strongly criticising idealism and the death it created on both the left and the right. Further, their support for hierarchy means that conservatives are generally very comfortable with the inequality that capitalism produces. Moreover, conservatism values tradition as an organic society. Capitalism is seen as an integral part of the economic tradition in many societies, not just as a set of economic mechanisms, but as part of the cultural and historical fabric that has evolved organically over time. Conservatives argue that disrupting this system will not only be impractical but also disrespectful to the legacy and wisdom of past generations. The idea of the free market in which individuals naturally trade with each other is consistent with an organic rather than designed society. The support for property rights is equally paramount in conservative thought. Property is seen as a cornerstone of a stable society, and ownership encourages responsibility and discourages support for socialist ideologies that could upturn the social order. So then, let's look at traditional conservatism's views on capitalism and property. Traditional conservatives were strong supporters of capitalism and property, which were seen as being the most pragmatic and tested economic system, based on the accumulated wisdom and tradition of experience. Both capitalism and property were also seen as important to maintaining hierarchy and social order, whilst they were comfortable with the inequalities that this could create. Traditional conservatives didn't support paternalistic economic policies to the same extent that One Nation Conservatism did, but also weren't libertarians ideologically opposed to state intervention in the economy like the New Right. Burke, a key traditional conservative, was wary of the potential of unregulated economic liberalism, and the unfettered pursuit of individual wealth if it led to social injustice and undermined communal bonds. It is important to recognise here, however, that traditional conservatism was first articulated prior to the full-scale development of industrialisation and economic equalities and social issues that came along with it. It seems reasonable to suggest that their beliefs in change to conserve and pragmatism may have led them to supporting similar policies as to one nation conservatism, given this changed context. So now then, let's look at one nation's conservatism's view on capitalism and property. One nation conservatism strongly supports capitalism due to the pragmatic approach and respect for tradition it shares with traditional conservatism. Due to their greater emphasis on paternalism and the need to change to conserve in the context of industrialisation, however, they support more state intervention to ensure the welfare of all members of society. One nation conservatives recognise that in the face of the societal changes and increasing inequality brought about by industrialisation, some degree of state intervention and reform was necessary to prevent social unrest and maintain national cohesion. They were also influenced by their paternalism, which led to the belief that the state should take proactive steps to improve the welfare of the less privileged members of society through policies designed to alleviate poverty and provide social welfare. In the 19th century, Disraeli's government enacted a number of social reforms aimed at improving the living conditions for the working class in the context of the social and economic disparities that industrialisation created. Firstly, then, the Public Health Act of 1875 provided public health and sanitary conditions in towns and cities. And then the Factory Act of 1874 reduced the working hours for women and children and implemented stricter safety conditions and regulations in factories. Disraeli also introduced an income tax as a permanent tax for the first time in order to give the government a steady source of revenue. This taxation wasn't progressive though, and it's important not to overstate the extent of one nation conservatism's support for government intervention in this period. In the post-World War II period, one nation conservative prime ministers, including Winston Churchill and Harold Macmillan, took a similarly pragmatic approach to the changing political and economic context, accepting a significant degree of state intervention in the economy. One nation conservatives in this period accepted the introduction of a comprehensive welfare state by the Labour government, recognising that it played an important role in ensuring social stability and preventing the deprivation seen in the pre-war years. It's important, however, to recognise that this didn't mean one nation conservatives wholeheartedly supported all the measures in this period. In fact, many originally opposed nationalisation, and neither Winston Churchill or Harold Macmillan extended it when they were prime ministers. The fact that they didn't reverse them, however, reflects not only a changing societal context, but also their pragmatic approach that recognised the importance of changing to conserve. Next then, let's look at the New Right's view on capitalism and property. The New Right's rise to prominence came in part due to the strong opposition to One Nation Conservatives' approach of acceptance of Labour's post-war reforms, in particular the extensive welfare state and nationalisation. The New Right saw themselves as the true Conservatives through their return to neoconservative economic policy and advocacy for rolling back the state in the economy and welfare. The New Right were driven by libertarianism, which centred on the promotion of liberty, autonomy and free choice, particularly in economic affairs. This resulted in them advocating for minimal state interference in the economy and laissez-faire capitalism. They believed in limited taxation, low spending and regulation, so that individuals and businesses were left free to act how they wished. This laissez-faire capitalistic approach, they believed, was not only the most efficient economic system, but also the most moral economic system, as it didn't interfere with individuals' free choices. Nozick's justification for libertarianism, building on Immanuel Kant's principle that individuals should never be treated merely as a means to an end, but always as an end in and of themselves. The New Right strongly supported property rights, believing property ownership to be a fundamental right and important to promoting self-reliance and economic initiative. They argued that when individuals have property rights, they are more inclined to take care of their property and to make productive use of it, leading to overall economic growth and stability. Also, importantly, they believed that they were also more likely to be autonomous and to resist the expansion of the state which threatened freedom. The New Right's economic thought can be seen clearly in the writing of Ayn Rand and Robert Nozick. Ayn Rand was strongly opposed to the welfare state, seeing it as curtailing individual freedom and as a step towards authoritarianism. Nozick too was opposed to the welfare state as to extensive taxation. He saw both of these as dangerously infringing upon individual autonomy and freedom in the name of supporting others. Margaret Thatcher was a staunch advocate of neoliberal economics and significantly changed Britain's economic policy in line with these new right principles when she was in power. One of her most important actions was the widespread privatisation of state-owned industries, which included British Telecom, British Gas and British Airways. This was more intended to reduce state involvement in the economy and increase competition and efficiency in these sectors. Deregulation was another key aspect of her tenure. She removed many of the regulatory controls over industries in the financial sector, and most notably with the Big Bang reforms in the London financial district in 1986. Thatcher also implemented significant tax reforms, reducing the top rates of income tax to encourage investment and entrepreneurship. And Thatcher's government also introduced the Right to Buy scheme, which was a landmark housing policy that allowed millions of council home tenants to purchase their homes at a discounted rate, fostering a shift towards more property ownership aligned with the new right's emphasis on personal autonomy. Let's now then look at the idea of the organic society and state. The concept of an organic society and state is a fundamental aspect of conservative thought, emphasising that society and the state develop naturally and cannot be artificially designed or engineered. Conservatives disagree with the liberal view that the state and society can be designed through rational thought like a machine. Instead, they view society as a living organism that needs to be kept alive. Every part is crucial to the role, and changes occurred gradually and naturally, though an evolutionary process rather than through intentional planning, which creates significant risks. This perspective inherently values the stability and cohesion of the whole over the needs and desires of the individual parts. Conservatives believe that society and the state have developed the way they have for a reason. Rather than seeking to change them suddenly, we should listen to tradition and seek to maintain the structure of society. This reflects the principle of empiricism and focusing on what the past and present can teach us, rather than seeking to design a hypothetical, ideal future as socialists do. Authority and hierarchy are therefore seen as natural and necessary components of a cohesive society, ensuring clearly defined roles, order and efficient functioning. In the UK, this leads to Conservatives opposing the codification of the Constitution. They view the British Constitution, unwritten and shaped by centuries of tradition and practice, as a prime example of an organic system which is flexible, adaptive and deeply embedded in the country's history and culture. So let's look at traditional conservative support of an organic society and localism. Traditional conservatives strongly endorse the concept of an organic society with a deep respect for tradition and established institutions. This perspective leads them to value and protect long-standing institutions like the church and the monarchy, seeing them not merely as relics of the past, but as vital organs of society that provide continuity, stability and a sense of identity. This belief in an organic society can be seen in Burke's advocacy for localism and what he called the little platoons of society. And when he says little platoons, Burke means the smaller communities and associations such as family, local communities and social groups that provide individuals with security, status and a sense of belonging. Traditional conservatives saw society as a collection of localised communities. These smaller units are where people form their primary loyalties and learn the values of mutual support, responsibility and tradition. So One Nation conservatism support for an organic, cohesive society. One Nation conservatives agree that with traditional conservatives' view that society should develop organically, respecting established traditions and institutions, and valuing the role of smaller communities and associations as foundational to societal health. Their support for an organic society is also clear in their advocacy for a cohesive, patriotic national unit. They emphasise patriotism and the idea of a cohesive society despite differences in class, religion or background. Citizens have more in common with what divides them. This perspective champions a sense of moral unity and shared purpose, where society is seen as a collective entity working towards common goals. The emphasis is on social harmony with a focus on what unites rather than divides. Through this view, they seek to challenge socialists who argue that society is defined by class oppression and that the working class should revolt and overthrow the bourgeoisie who are in power. So then, the New Right's rejection of an organic society and the support for atomism. The New Right's view of society differs majorly from the traditional or one-nation conservatives' view. For them, society is less of an organically evolving entity shaped by traditions and communal relationships, and more a collective of individuals pursuing their own interests. This is brought together in the principle of atomism. Rather than emphasising the organic development of society and the importance of communal bonds and social cohesion, the New Right's focus on promoting individualism and ensuring the state's role is minimised to prevent it from infringing upon individual freedoms. Atomism is the belief that society is primarily made up of distinct, independent individuals. This is very different from traditional conservatives' emphasis on localism or one-nation conservatives' emphasis on a cohesive society, and shares the New Right's approach to economic management, social policy and the role of the state in society. They advocate for a minimal state, arguing that the best outcomes in society arise when individuals are free to pursue their own interests with limited government interference. Personal initiative, competition and the free market are the drivers of progress and prosperity. Thatcher was known for a strong support for an atomistic view of society that centred on individuals, stating in 1987 that there is no such thing as society, there are individual men and women and there are families. So then, let's now look at the conservative idea of human imperfection. Human imperfection is a key principle of conservative thought, arguing that humans are flawed, which makes them incapable of making good decisions for themselves. This pessimistic interpretation of human nature is very different from liberals' far more optimistic interpretation. This idea can be first seen in Hobbes's Leviathan, which set out the belief that, in the absence of a strong state, human life would inevitably fall into a state of constant conflict and competition for resources and power. Hobbes here stated that life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short. This was due to his belief that humans are ruthless, calculating and inherently driven by their basic instinct for survival and self-interest, which would lead to them conflicting with each other. This bleak outlook on human nature led Hobbes to argue for the establishment of a strong central authority, a Leviathan, to impose order and prevent the descent into chaos and violence. Hobbes's view set the foundation for conservative beliefs in the necessity of a guiding authority to maintain order and stability. Conservatives believed that human nature and imperfection was a constant, and that politicians therefore need to accommodate it rather than try to alter it. The three aspects of human imperfection specifically talked about are psychological imperfection, moral imperfection, and intellectual imperfection. And obviously, these are quite self-explanatory. So then, traditional conservatives' interpretation of human nature. Traditional conservatives' interpretation of human imperfection is deeply influenced by Christian teachings about the original sin and the fallibility of man. This perspective was particularly central to the work of Burke, who emphasised the need for moral guidance and structure in society, provided by long-established institutions such as the Church, which he viewed as crucial in instilling values and moral education. Traditional conservatives believe that this inherent imperfection necessitates a stable hierarchical social order. They argue that people are not inherently equipped to make decisions solely based on reason and individual judgment, thus requiring the guidance and authority of customs and the establishment of traditions. Importantly as well here is that traditional conservatives weren't as pessimistic about human nature as Hobbes and believe that these imperfections can be mitigated through the influence of tradition and proper guidance. This perspective represents a slight departure from Hobbes's bleak view of human nature as irrevocable self-interest and conflict-prone in the absence of a strong state. They believe that while humans are indeed imperfect, their nature can be shaped positively within the right social and moral framework. Oakeshott described human behaviour as noisy, foolish and flawed, a less pessimistic view you can see here than obviously what Hobbes described. This is why traditional conservatives place great emphasis on a civilising influence of institutions such as these little platoons, including the family, the church and people's communities. So then, what is One Nation's conservatives' interpretation of human nature? One Nation conservatives' view on human nature is largely consistent with that of traditional conservatives. They also acknowledge the inherent imperfections in human nature, recognising that individuals are driven by a mix of self-interest, emotions and limited rationality. This leads them to strongly support paternalism in governance. They believe that states should act in a protective manner, supporting citizens who are vulnerable to the pitfalls of their own imperfections. This is seen as a way to maintain social harmony and stability while guiding society towards moral and rational decisions. One development that can be noted is their recognition that humans need a certain level of practical support in an industrialised capitalist economy that creates inequalities and risks poor living and working conditions. So then, the New Right's rejection of human imperfection. The New Right's interpretation of human nature is very different to that of traditional and one-nation conservatives. They don't see humans as imperfect. Instead, they see them as rational and self-interested, and see this as a positive thing that creates a potential for self-governance and self-improvement. The New Right believes that individuals are inherently driven to pursue their own goals and interests. Rather than seeing this self-interest as a negative, they believe it is beneficial for society as a whole and that the state shouldn't get in the way of rational self-interest. This belief fundamentally shares their views on how the state and economy should operate, as well as the belief that society is and should be atomistic. Rand argued that self-interest not only benefited society, but was a moral imperative. In her philosophy of objectivism, Rand posited that pursuing one's own happiness and interest is the highest moral pursuit, a view that fundamentally opposes the notion of self-sacrifice for collective goals. The New Right's belief about human nature is articulated in Nojik's theory of self-ownership. This asserts that individuals have sovereignty over their bodies and the fruits of their labour, and as a result, individuals should be free to choose how they use their abilities and resources without coercive interference from the state. This underlines the New Right's opposition to redistributive policies, as such actions are seen as infringements on personal liberty and property rights. And then let's look at the conservative idea of the state, which should provide order and security. The role of the state in providing order and security is a central tenet of conservative ideology. Conservatives believe that the primary function of the state is to maintain social order and ensure the security of its citizens, rather than to seek progressive ends. This belief stems from a recognition of human imperfection and the need for structured authority to manage societal relations and protect individuals from harm. This fundamental belief can be traced back to Hobbes, who set out that a strong state is necessary in order to prevent the chaos and conflict in the state of nature. As a result, it is necessary for individuals to give up some of their individual rights to the state so that it can provide order and security. Hobbes also supported the view that authority of the state shouldn't be challenged, stating that the sovereign power cannot justly be questioned or opposed once it has been established. Also, the state is seen as a guarantor of order, providing a framework within which individuals can live, work and interact safely with each other. It not only protected the physical safety of citizens and prevents conflict, it also protects social norms and values, property rights and the rule of law, with significant emphasis on preventing crime and civil unrest. So then, traditional one-nation conservatives support for the state providing order and security. Both traditional and one-nation conservatives are strongly influenced by the thought of Hobbes and argue that the state's key role is to provide order and public safety. They argue that human nature's inherent imperfections necessitate a strong authoritative state to impose law and order, preventing societal descent into chaos. They support robust law enforcement, a strong judicial system, and a capable defence apparatus to protect the nation from external threats. This can be seen in the policies of the Conservative government under Prime Minister Robert Peel in the 19th century. Peel, who is often credited with the establishment of modern policing, founded the Metropolitan Police Service in 1829, and this move towards a professional and organised police force exemplified a traditional conservative emphasis on law and order as essential for societal stability and was a pragmatic recognition for the need to tackle the growing challenges of crime and disorder in an increasingly urbanised industrial society. So then, the New Right's support for the state providing order and security. The New Right, despite its advocacy for rolling back the state in economic affairs, strongly supports the state as capable of providing order and security. This stance is rooted in their belief that a secure and orderly environment is essential for the functioning of freedom, market innovation, and individual liberties. The new right's view that the state's role in ensuring law and order as fundamental in creating a stable backdrop against which free market activities and personal freedoms can thrive. Neoconservatism in particular emphasised the necessity of a strong state in defence and policing. Neoconservatives argued for robust national defence capabilities and effective law enforcement as essential components of national sovereignty and public safety. This was most evident during Thatcher's government. During her tenure, Thatcher prioritised defence and law enforcement in government spending, even in times of broader public sector cutbacks. This policy approach reflects the new right's belief in the primacy of the state's protective role. It aligns with their broader view that national security and public order are paramount, creating the conditions necessary for economic prosperity and the exercise of people's individual freedoms. Thus, while advocating for a reduced role of the state in economic and social welfare matters, the new right maintains a firm stance on the necessity of a strong, effective state apparatus for defence and law enforcement. And then let's look at state, society, economy and human nature, and how the key strands of conservatism agree and disagree with these different aspects, starting first then with the state. So some key agreements here is that the state is a key role of the state is to provide order and security, and then some disagreements. The new right supports libertarianism and a very minimal role for the state in the economy, contrasting with the view of One Nation conservatives in particular. And traditional and One Nation conservatives believe the state should act in paternalistic hierarchical manner, though in different ways, which strongly contrasts with the new right's rejection of paternalism and hierarchy. And then traditional and One Nation conservatives strongly support the idea that the state should act based on pragmatism and tradition, and this strongly contrasts with the new right, which believe the state should be driven by ideological support for freedoms. Next, then, society. And some key agreements again. Acceptance of a significant degree of inequality in society itself. And again, all strands believe that order, security and property rights are crucial to a stable and successful society. I do apologise about the spelling mistake. Some key disagreements, however, are that traditional One Nation conservatives believe in an organic, cohesive society and localism, whereas the new right rejects this key belief and believes in an individualist, atomistic view of society. And again, traditional One Nation conservatives believe in paternalism and hierarchy in society, whilst the new right rejects paternalism and hierarchy. And the new right's view on society is driven by ideological support for freedom, whilst the views of traditional and One Nation conservatives are shaped by pragmatism and tradition. And then let's look at the economy. And again, a couple key agreements here is an acceptance of a significant degree of inequality within the economy itself, and also a strong support for capitalism and property rights. And again, some disagreements. Firstly, the new right believes in libertarianism and very limited state intervention in the economy, which strongly rejects One Nation conservatism's belief in paternalistic state in economic affairs. Also, traditional and One Nation conservatives believe in hierarchy within the economy and society, which is strongly rejected by the new right. And the new right supports capitalism for very different reasons than One Nation and traditional conservatives. The new right is driven by ideological support for freedom, whilst the other strands are driven by pragmatism and tradition. And then human nature. Some key agreements again is that the state is needed to provide order and security, and without it, human nature would lead to conflict and civil unrest. And the principle of human imperfection, which shows conservative views on the state, economy and society. And again, finally, some disagreements here is that traditional and One Nation conservatives strongly believe in human imperfection. The new right rejects this pessimistic interpretation of human nature, believing instead that humans are rational and self-interested, and seeing this in a positive light. And traditional and One Nation conservatives believe that paternalism, tradition and these little platoons are important and necessary for guiding human nature in the right direction, whereas the new right strongly rejects this, believing in individualism rather than localism, and that intervention creates dependency. So then let's now look at the differing views and tensions within conservatism, and let's start with the emergence of conservatism. How Hobbes preceded conservatism, but he laid the foundations for some of its principles. Thomas Hobbes preceded the development of conservatism as an ideology. However, his landmark work Leviathan, which was published in 1651, set out some key ideas that would be consistent with and inform key principles of conservatism. particularly in relation to human nature and the role of the state. He argued that in the absence of a strong and stable government, human life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short, supporting a view of human nature as inherently self-interested and prone to conflict. Hobbes' support for a sovereign authority, which he termed the Leviathan, was grounded in the notion that a robust and authoritative state is essential to curb the natural tendencies of humans towards disorder. Therefore, while Hobbes himself was not a conservative in the modern sense of the word, his ideas in the Leviathan about human nature and the necessity of a powerful state to ensure societal stability have become integral to many strands of conservative thought. So then, the emergence of conservatism as a reaction to liberalism and the French Revolution. Conservatism emerged as a reaction to the liberal ideas and the radical societal changes brought in by the French Revolution. The 1789 revolution upended the traditional aristocratic and religious order in favour of liberal Enlightenment ideas of liberty, equality and fraternity. This upheaval, which saw a dramatic restructuring of society and government, including the overthrow of the monarch and the violent reign of terror, alarmed many who feared the instability and chaos that such a drastic change entailed. In response, conservatism developed as a philosophy emphasising the preservation of tradition, hierarchy, and a cautious, pragmatic approach to change. The Whig English MP Edmund Burke, often referred to as the father of conservatism, was central in articulating this new political stance. In his book Reflections on the Revolution in France, Burke argued for the importance of maintaining established traditions, social hierarchy, and a gradual evolution of institutions. Conservatism therefore arose not just as a counter to liberalism's emphasis on individual rights and reason, but also as a practical response to the perceived excesses and unpredictability of revolutionary change. Burke's articulation of these ideas laid the groundwork for what would become modern conservatism, influencing generations of thinkers and political ideas who sought to balance the need for progress with the preservation of social cohesion and stability. Now then, let's look at traditional conservatism. Starts with Burke's clear articulation of traditional conservatism. Edmund Burke's traditional conservatism was grounded in several key principles that reflected a cautious approach to societal change and reverence of tradition. He set out his case against the French Revolution and the principles that would come to define traditional conservatism in his work Reflections of the Revolution in France, published in 1790. Pragmatism emphasised the importance of practical experience over abstract theorising. Burke believed that decisions should be based on the accumulated wisdom of history and tradition, rather than radical ideals or revolutionary fervour. He also set out the importance of change to conserve, emphasising the necessity of careful and gradual reform to preserve the essence of traditions and institutions while adapting to contemporary needs. This reverence for tradition underscored the belief in the enduring value of established customs, institutions and norms that had been tested by time. This tradition should be maintained and learned from. Property was also seen as a cornerstone of a stable society, and ownership encourages responsibility and discourages support for radical ideologies that threaten to upturn the societal order. He also upheld the notions of hierarchy and authority, viewing them as natural and necessary for a stable society. For Burke, societal order was not artificially constructed, but rather evolved organically, akin to a living organism. And Burke's conservatism was also based on an acknowledgement of human imperfection. He argued that human beings are fallible and limited in their capacity to understand and engineer complex social systems. Therefore, humanity and restraint should guide political actions, advocating for incremental change rather than radical overhaul. And these principles of pragmatism, tradition, hierarchy, authority, organic society and human imperfection collectively form the bedrock of Burke's conservative thought, offering a cautious and evolutionary approach to social and political life. And then traditional conservatives' interpretation of Britain in the early 19th century. Traditional conservative beliefs in the early 19th century led to conservatives in Britain strongly upholding the monarchy and the Church of England, which it saw as key pillars of tradition and order in society. The monarchy especially was seen as a key symbol of national unity. This led to strong support for the monarch, irrespective of who the monarch was, and initial opposition to the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829, which allowed Catholics to hold public office from conservatives, including Robert Peel. Conservatives in this period also strongly supported maintaining a hierarchical social structure and recognised that a key role of the state was to maintain order and security in society. This can be seen in the policies of the Conservative government under Prime Minister Robert Peel in the 19th century, and as mentioned already, Peel is credited as for the foundation of the Metropolitan Police Service in 1829. Conservative support for hierarchy can be seen in the fact that many of them were initially opposed to the 1832 Reform Act, which restructured the British electoral system by redistributing parliamentary seats and expanding the electoral system to include more middle-class men. And Conservatives feared that this altering the existing electoral system would disrupt the social order and undermine the influence of the aristocracy. And then Oakeshott's restatement of traditional conservatism in the mid-20th century. And in the mid-20th century, Michael Oakeshott restated the principles of support for traditional conservatism, especially in his essay on being conservative. Oakeshott's conservatism was anchored in the principle of pragmatism. He argued that political action should be guided by practical knowledge and experience rather than ideological dogmatism and theoretical abstraction. This stance was a deliberate counter to the utopian visions of perfect societies promoted by both communism and fascism earlier in the 20th century, which he saw not only as impractical but as deeply dangerous due to their tendency to justify radical and disruptive changes in pursuit of their ideals. Moreover, Oakeshott emphasised the importance of learning from tradition. He viewed tradition not as a static entity but as a dynamic, evolving process that encapsulated the wisdom and experiences of the past. This respect for tradition was coupled with an acknowledgement of human imperfection, and Oakeshott recognised that human beings are inherently limited in their knowledge and capacity to design perfect systems, and he supported the view that human imperfection was a constant and that politicians therefore needed to accommodate it rather than try to alter it. Next then, let's look at One Nation conservatism and the development of One Nation conservatism in response to industrialisation and the growth in support for socialism. One Nation conservatism emerged in the mid to late 19th century in response to the profound societal changes brought about by industrialisation, as well as the growing influence and appeal of socialism among the working classes. Benjamin Disraeli was a key figure in the ideological development and an important Conservative Prime Minister. One Nation conservatism represented a strategic and philosophical adaptation of traditional conservative values to the realities of a changing society. Disraeli and his followers recognised the need for conservatism to embrace reform in order to conserve. They understood that in the context of urbanising and the equalities created by industrial capitalism, it was necessary to address the grievances of the working and lower classes. Otherwise, they thought, the support for socialism would grow and threatening revolution and the societal order and hierarchy being completely upturned. This approach was justified through paternalism, encapsulated in the idea, as already mentioned, noblesse oblige, which set out that the upper classes had a moral responsibility to look after the well-being of those less fortunate than them. And One Nation conservatism also emphasised patriotism and the idea of a cohesive society by supporting the idea that everyone was together in one nation. And Disraeli believed that emphasising national unity and shared values was essential to counter the class divisions and conflict which was stoked by socialist ideologies. And this approach was a strategic means to preserve the key principles of traditional conservatism, including the respect for tradition and the social hierarchy. And by adapting to the changes brought about by industrialisation and the emerging social and political challenges, One Nation conservatism sought to ensure the continuity and relevance of conservative principles in a rapidly evolving society. So then, One Nation conservatism in practice in the 19th century. In the 19th century, Disraeli's government enacted a number of social reforms aimed at improving living conditions for the working classes in the context of the social and economic disparities that industrialisation created. Disraeli also introduced income tax as a permanent tax for the first time in order to give the government a steady source of revenue. This taxation wasn't progressive though, and it's important not to over-exaggerate it. Disraeli also introduced the Second Reform Act in 1867, which significantly expanded the franchise, roughly doubling the electorate by lowering property requirements for voting, which allowed many working class men to vote for the first time. and by extending the franchise, the Act aimed to integrate a broader segment of society into the political process, thereby reducing the likelihood of social unrest and aligning with One Nation Conservatives' principle of changing to conserve. And then One Nation Conservatism in practice in the 20th century. In the post-World War II period, One Nation Conservatives included Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Harold Macmillan, which took a similarly pragmatic approach to this changing political and economic context, accepting a significant degree of state intervention in the economy. And it's briefly here, it's just quick to mention when we talk about the Prime Ministership of Winston Churchill, we're talking about his second time in the early 1950s, so it's just important to keep that in mind. As already mentioned earlier, One Nation Conservatives in this period accepted the introduction of a comprehensive welfare state introduced by the Labour government, and it is important to recognise that this didn't mean One Nation Conservative wholeheartedly supported all the measures in this period. Next then, the emergence of the New Right. The emergence of the New Right as a rejection to One Nation Conservatism. The New Right's emergence in the 1970s, partly in reaction to what its proponents perceived as One Nation Conservatives' excessive concessions to socialist policies and ideas. It began in America, but quickly influenced the UK too, and the New Right became especially associated with and implemented by Margaret Thatcher in Britain and Ronald Reagan in the United States. The New Right positioned itself as the revival of true conservatism, arguing that One Nation Conservatism had strayed too far from fundamental conservative principles. However, the New Right's philosophy and policy approach can be seen in many ways as aligning more closely with classical liberalism, especially in its emphasis on individual freedom and a free market economy. The New Right is a combination of neoliberalism and neoconservatism. And neoliberalism, with its roots in classical liberalism thought, advocates for minimal state interventions in the economy and emphasising free markets and individual enterprise, whereas neoconservatism, while sharing some principles with traditional conservatism, particularly in its focus on traditional values, strong national defence and law and order, diverged in its approach to social policy and welfare. And a key departure of the New Right from earlier conservative traditions is its support for atomism over an organic view of society. Traditional conservatism, as already mentioned, viewed society as an interconnected, evolving organism where each part has a role in the larger whole, where by contrast the New Right perceives society as a collective of individuals, each pursuing their own interest, leading to the best outcomes when allowed maximum freedom without excessive state intervention. This perspective rejects the notions of hierarchy and paternalism, which are key principles of conservative thought. The New Right also supports the view that humans are rational beings in a meritocratic system, where individuals' success based on their own efforts and talents shouldn't be interfered with. This perspective rejects that human imperfection and support for hierarchy and paternalism, which are key principles of conservative thought. And unlike traditional and One Nation conservatism, which value pragmatism and tradition, the New Right is more ideologically driven, focusing on the principles of freedom and individualism. So then, the New Right as a combination of neoliberalism and neoconservatism. First then, neoliberalism. This is an economic and political ideology that supports laissez-faire capitalism, which means free markets, low public spending, low taxation, and a minimal government intervention in the economy. This is rooted in classical liberal thought. Neoliberalism posits that private enterprise and open competition are the most efficient ways to produce economic growth, whilst also not infringing upon individual freedoms. And laissez-faire capitalism is therefore the most efficient and most moral economic system. And Robert Nozick, another neoliberal thinker, was opposed to the welfare state and to expensive taxation. He saw both these as dangerously infringing upon the individual autonomy and freedom with the name of supporting others. Neoliberals' emphasis on individual autonomy and freedom was influenced by their positive view on humans as rational beings and contributed to their support for atomism and opposed to hierarchy and paternalism. Next then, neoconservatism. Neoconservatism's approach emphasised the vital role of the state in maintaining order and security, both domestically and internationally, and supported significant state funding to enable this. This stance was particularly poignant during the Cold War, when the perceived threat from the Soviet Union led to neoconservatives support for robust and assertive foreign policy. And neoconservatives within the New Right advocated for a strong military and an active role for their country, supporting interventions abroad to combat communist influence. And neoconservatism was also characterised by a cultural and moral dimension, advocating for anti-permissiveness and a return to traditional Christian values. Now, are these two things compatible or are they incompatible? On the one hand, it can be argued that neoliberalism and neoconservatism are inherently incompatible and opposed. The former comes from a liberal tradition and the latter from a conservative. Further, neoliberalism supports significantly decreasing the size of the state and level of intervention, whilst neoconservatism supports a significant state role in defence and law and order. But, on the other hand, it can be argued they are compatible and that they did work together effectively. Neoliberal policies, by shrinking state involvement in the economy, free up resources, and these resources can then be directed towards defence and law and order, which do then align with neoconservative policies. So then, Thatcher's government as a case study for the new right. Thatcher was a staunch advocate for neoliberal economics and significantly changed Britain's economic policy in line with these new right principles when in power. As already mentioned, she privatised many state-owned industries along with her Big Bang reforms to the financial sector in 1986 and lowering taxes for top-rate earners of income tax to encourage investment and entrepreneurship. And during her tenure, Thatcher prioritised defence and law and order in government spending, even in times of broader public sector cutbacks. Thatcher's government also took significant steps to curb what it saw as social permissiveness, notably through legislation like Section 28, which prohibited the promotion of homosexuality by local authorities and in schools, thereby reinforcing traditional sexual norms. And Thatcher's government was marked by a firm stance against the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and with a very close political alignment with the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. And then, conservative thinkers and their ideas. Firstly then, let's start with Thomas Hobbes. And what strand is he from? He came from conservatism, but traditional conservatism. He came before conservatism, but traditional conservatism if you have to describe him as anything. And he's not going to be relevant for every essay, but should definitely be brought in when talking about human nature and the role of the state in providing order. So, Thomas Hobbes preceded the development of conservatism as an ideology, however. His most important work, Leviathan, published in 1651, set out some of his key ideas that would be consistent with and inform key principles of conservatism, particularly in relation to human nature and the role of the state. Hobbes argued that in the absence of a strong state, human life would inevitably fall into a state of constant conflict and competition for resources and power, and the famous quote being that their life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short. Hobbes therefore argued that a strong state is necessary in order to prevent chaos and conflict in the state of nature. It is necessary for individuals to give some of their individual rights to a sovereign authority state, so that it can provide order and security. In this state, this Leviathan, as it were, should possess the power to enforce laws and maintain peace, thus preventing the chaos of a state of nature. He stated, how could a state be governed or protected in its foreign relations and every individual remain free to obey or not to obey the law according to his private opinion? And once established, Hobbes argued that the authority of the state couldn't and shouldn't be challenged, stating that the sovereign power cannot justly be questioned or opposed once it has been established. Next then, let's look at Edmund Burke, who is a traditional conservative, and he's very important and he should really be mentioned in every single essay you do. Edmund Burke was a Whig MP and is often referred to as the father of conservatism. He founded conservative thought in response to the French Revolution, which upended the traditional aristocratic and religious order in favour of the liberal Enlightenment ideals of liberty, equality and fraternity. He strongly opposed this upheaval and argued in his work The Reflections on the Revolution in France for the importance of maintaining established traditions, social hierarchy and a gradual evolution of institutions. This text outlined the key principles of conservatism, including the importance of tradition, pragmatism, a cautious approach to change, human imperfection and organic society in hierarchy. Burke strongly supported listening to and learning from tradition. This emphasis was not about preserving old ways for their own sake. Instead, it was driven by empiricism, which tradition represented the accumulated wisdom of past societies. It offered invaluable guidance for how decisions should be made in society and by the state. Burke also views respect for tradition as crucial for maintaining stability and security within society. Due to this emphasis on tradition, he favoured organic, gradual developments instead of abrupt, radical shifts. Burke didn't support not changing at all, however, famously stating, "A state without the means of change is without the means of its own conservation." He set out the importance of changing to conserve, emphasising that though change should be gradual and careful, it was something necessary to maintain the future of the state and society, and not adapting to the time and refusing to change at all would simply increase the chances of a revolution taking place. Burke's view on human nature was strongly influenced by Christianity, and Christian teachings about the original sin and the fallibility of man led him to argue that human nature was imperfect, and as a result, Burke emphasised the need for moral guidance and structure in society, provided by long-established institutions such as the church and the monarchy, which he viewed as crucial in instilling values and moral education. In his work Reflection on the Revolution in France, Burke wrote, "Men are qualified for civil liberty in exact proportion to their disposition to put moral chains upon their own appetites." This has led to Burke's advocacy for localism, in what he called the little platoons of society. And as mentioned already, we've covered these little platoons. So they are really just these little small community groups, clubs, what obviously at the time were very popular in provincial England especially. Next then, let's look at Benjamin Disraeli. He's a one-nation conservative, and despite not being a named thinker on the specification, he's a key thinker for one-nation conservatism and should be used in most essays as an example of their views. And Benjamin Disraeli, as mentioned already, was an important Conservative Prime Minister and a key figure in the emergence of one-nation conservatism in the mid to late 19th century. One-nation conservatism represented a strategic and philosophical adaptation of traditional conservative values to the realities of an industrialised, changing society. And Disraeli and his followers recognised the need for conservatism to embrace reform in order to conserve. And Disraeli argued that in the context of a growing urbanisation and the equalities created by industrial capitalism, it was necessary to address the grievances of the working and lower classes. Otherwise, support for socialism would grow, threatening revolution, societal order and hierarchy being upturned. And Disraeli strongly supported paternalism, which we've already mentioned, and this is the belief that it's responsible for the state and the upper classes to safeguard those less privileged than themselves. And this paternalistic approach is rooted in a sense of moral duty, as articulated in the concept of noblesse oblige, and this principle, which literally translates to nobility obliges, embodies the belief that those in privileged positions have a duty to act with generosity and responsibility towards those less fortunate than themselves. And importantly, Disraeli's shift to one-nation conservatism and support for paternalism was not just due to a belief in moral duty, but also a pragmatic strategy to uphold and maintain order, hierarchy, and the position of the aristocracy atop the social hierarchy in their positions of wealth and power. It was, in essence, changing to conserve. Disraeli also emphasised patriotism and the idea of a cohesive society by supporting the idea that everyone was together in one nation. He believed that emphasising national unity and shared values was essential to counter the class divisions and conflicts stoked by socialist ideologies. And Disraeli sought to promote a romanticised version of the empire in the public imagination in order to build popular support for the nation and his government. So next then, let's look at Michael Oakeshott. He's a traditional conservative, and again, he's very important, and you should really bring him into every single essay you do. In the mid-20th century, Michael Oakeshott related the principles and support for traditional conservatism, especially in the essay on being conservative. He set out that conservatism continued to be of great value and argued against dogmatism of both the left and the right, which was key and which was very evident in the early 20th century, obviously. Oakeshott's conservatism was anchored in the principle of pragmatism. He argued that political action should be guided by practical knowledge and experience rather than ideological dogmatism or theoretical abstraction. This stance was a deliberate counter to the utopian versions of perfect societies promoted by both communism and fascism in the 20th century, which he saw not only as impractical but as deeply dangerous due to their tendency to justify radical and disruptive changes in pursuit of their ideals. Oakeshott's pragmatism was influenced by recognition that human beings are inherently limited in their knowledge and capacity to design perfect systems. He supported the view that human imperfection was a constant and that politicians therefore need to accommodate it rather than try to alter it. Importantly, however, he wasn't as pessimistic about human nature as Hobbes was, and believed that these imperfections can be mitigated through the influence of tradition and proper guidance. Oakeshott believed that while humans are indeed imperfect, their nature can be shaped positively with the right social and moral framework, and he described human behaviour as noisy, foolish and flawed, which obviously is a much less pessimistic view than that of Thomas Hobbes. Next then we have Ayn Rand, and she's of the New Right, and in particular in the neoliberal aspect of it, and she's very important too. And you should be bringing either her or Nozick into every essay that includes the New Right, but you really should, if you're trying to get for those top grades, you should try to bring them both in. Ayn Rand, a Russian-American novelist and philosopher, was a key figure in advocacy for neoliberalism and the New Right. Born in Russia and witnessing firsthand the consequences of the Bolshevik Revolution, Rand immigrated to the United States, and she became a fierce advocate of individualism and capitalism, contrasting sharply with the communist ideals of our homeland. She articulated her central philosophy of objectivism in her novels, most notably Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, which she championed the virtues of rational self-interest and laissez-faire capitalism. In her philosophy of objectivism, Rand argued that pursuing one's own happiness and rational self-interest is the highest moral pursuit, a viewpoint that fundamentally opposes the notion of self-sacrifice for collective goals. She believed that people were rational and could gain objective knowledge through reason. This can be seen in her opposition of personal altruism, which she viewed as the moral obligation to place the needs of others above one's own interests. She argued that altruism, where done by individuals or by the state, diminished individual freedom and success by creating an unhealthy dependence in those who are recipients of such altruistic actions. And Rand's strong support for freedom and laissez-faire capitalism is deeply rooted in her objectivism, which holds individual rights to be the highest importance and views freedom as essential for human flourishing. And Rand believed that freedom in both personal and economic realm is necessary for individuals to act on their rational judgment, pursue their own interests, and achieve their potential. She argued that laissez-faire capitalism, as an economic system where the government's role is strictly limited to protecting individual rights, is the only system that fully respects and protects the freedoms of the individual. Next then, let's look at Robert Nozick, and he is again from the New Right, and in particular again is a neoliberal aspect of it. And as before, he's very important, and you should either bring him or Nozick in, but really if you're trying to aim for those top grades, you should try to bring them both in when you talk about the New Right. And Robert Nozick was an American philosopher and academic, and he emerged as a significant intellectual figure in the development of the New Right through his strong defense of libertarian principles, and is best known for his 1974 book Anarchy, State and Utopia, which provided a philosophical argument against John Rawls's theory of distributive justice and advocated for libertarianism instead. Robert Nozick strongly supported libertarianism, which built on Kant's principle that individuals should never be treated merely as a mean to an end, but as always as an end of themselves. In Anarchy, State and Utopia, Nozick argued that representing individual rights is the core obligation of society, and any action that coerces individuals to serve collective purposes violates this principle. This led him to champion laissez-faire capitalism and a minimal state that was limited to the narrow functions of protecting individuals from force, theft and fraud, and enforcing contracts. He argued that any state action beyond these functions, such as redistributive taxation for social welfare purposes, is unjust because it infringes on individuals' rights to their own lives and property. Nozick's support for the idea of self-ownership asserts that individuals have sovereignty over their bodies and the fruits of their labour, and as a result, individuals should be free to choose how they use their abilities and resources without coercive interference from the state. And this underlines the New Right's opposition to redistributive policies, as such actions are seen as infringements on personal liberty and property rights. And according to Nozick, respecting self-ownership means that any exchange and transfer of property must be voluntary, based on free consent, and any coercion or redistribution by the state fundamentally infringes upon this basic human right. So that is everything from the specification, specifically for conservatism, that we've covered. So let's just quickly check over everything then. Starting obviously with the first point, we have been over pragmatism, tradition, human imperfection, organic society and state, paternalism and libertarianism. And then the thinkers, we have covered obviously Hobbes, Burke, Oakeshott, Rand and Nozick, and also in there we have included Disraeli. And then the differing views and tensions, we've obviously looked at traditional conservatism, one nation conservatism, and the New Right, and specifically neoliberal and neoconservatism. So thank you very much for watching. This was the first of the 3 videos I'm going to be making about the core principles. Obviously we'll cover conservatism here. I'll have a video on socialism out very shortly, also a video on liberalism. So again, thank you very much for watching. And I've also got a whole video series out covering everything you need to know for paper 1 in terms of the UK politics section. And I'm currently releasing videos, everything you need to know for paper 2 for the UK government. And in the future, very shortly, I'll be releasing things you need to know for paper 3, specifically the US government. So again, thank you very much for watching and see you next time.